Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll gain confidence, clarity, and a competitive edge in a crowded marketplace so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I'm talking about the latest WebAIM Million report. Stick around to get lots of insights about the top 6 accessibility errors, plus a few more, and how fixing them can have big impact on your websites. In case you're not familiar with the WebAIM Million report, since 2019, WebAIM has conducted an annual study where they evaluate the accessibility of the homepages of the top 1 million websites using their WAVE tool. Now, this was the first year where the way that the sample sites were selected was slightly different. In previous years, they used what they called the WebAIM Million, and this year they used what's called the Tranco list. And they only included domains that could be directly registered. So they excluded subdomains. They also excluded CDNs, image and data servers, and APIs. This report gives us a very interesting look at the state of website accessibility today. Okay, first off, WebAIM found that almost 96% of homepages had detectable WCAG 2 failures. Now remember, WAVE is an automated checker. And in general, automated checkers can detect only about 25% to 30% of accessibility issues. And, this can be more or it can be less, depending on the checker that's being used and also on the site. Now, I mention this because it means that the accessibility of these sites is worse than these findings. So just keep that in mind. Now, since 2019, pages with accessibility errors did not even decrease by 2%. Okay, WebAIM said the proportion of pages with fewer errors has increased, while the number of pages with many errors has also increased. Pages with fewer errors have gotten better, while pages with many errors have gotten worse. Now, WebAIM defined errors as WAVE-detected accessibility barriers having notable end-user impact, and which have a very high likelihood of being WCAG 2.2 level A and or AA conformance failures. In the accessibility test, WebAIM found an average of 56.8 accessibility errors per page. That's a lot. Last year, there were an average of 50 errors per page, so that number went up from last year. But between 2020 and 2021, there was actually a decline, and then it was pretty steady until 2023, and then this year it increased. Now, the home pages that they tested had, get this, almost 1,200 page elements. The number of homepage elements increased by almost 12% in the past year, and it's increased every year since they started testing homepages in 2019. Almost 5% of the homepage elements had detectable accessibility errors, which means that users with a disability could come across an error in about 1 in every 21 of these homepage elements. So that's pretty frequent. The top 100,000 pages had an average of 1,424 errors. Again, that's a lot. WebAIM also revealed the industries of the websites they tested, along with the average number of errors and percentage of difference, better or worse, compared with the average homepage. Some of the worst ones were in the sports industry, then the real estate industry, shopping, news and weather, style and fashion, travel, and automotive. So hey, if you're looking for clients who need this type of work, those are some good places to start. They also found that the majority of accessibility errors fell into 6 categories, and those are low contrast text, missing alt text, missing form input labels, empty hyperlinks, empty buttons, and a missing document language. So let's dive into some of the data found on them and what that means for users, how it impacts them. Okay, so number 1 is low contrast text. Low contrast text means that users with low vision or another type of visual disability, and heck, even users without a visual disability, may not be able to read the text. Now, like in years past, one of the most common WCAG 2 failures was this low contrast text, and it was found on 81% of homepages. This has actually decreased for the most part since 2019, when it was about 85%. Each homepage that was tested had about 35 instances of low contrast text. And this was an increase from last year, which had an average of 30.4 instances. The next most frequently found error was alt text on images, which was found on 54.5% of the homepages. This too has declined for the most part since 2019. About 12 images per homepage had missing alt text. I mean, that seems like a lot, right? Well, almost half of those were linked images, which means that users of assistive technology cannot tell what the link is for. Almost 15% of images that had alt text had questionable or repetitive alt text, which isn't helpful to someone who cannot see the images. So that means that users of assistive technology, such as a screen reader, they didn't get the content of the image, or they didn't understand some of the images that they should have been able to. Now, the number of form inputs, such as form fields, for example, the number of those on the home pages alone almost doubled over the past 5 years. Almost 49%, almost half of home pages had missing form input labels. This is an increase of about 3% from last year. Just over a third of the form inputs were not labeled properly, by using the label tag or by using some ARIA code or a title attribute. And this is a problem because users of assistive technology will not be able to understand what each field is for. Do I put my first name here? Where do I put my email? What goes in this other field? Empty hyperlinks were another issue. Empty links are hyperlinks that lead to nowhere, such as a pound sign as the only content or no link text at all. And this means that the purpose of the link will not be clear. So this can cause confusion, especially for screen reader users. Where will this link take me? Why should I click on it? Empty hyperlinks were found on approximately 45% of homepages. And in 2019, it was as high as 58%. Empty buttons were found on 28% of pages, and this increased from last year. So this means that users of screen readers may not know what the button will do. And if there's only one button, they might assume it's, let's say to submit a form. But what if there's a reset button that's next to it? What if the button is for search or it's for filtering content? Buttons are used for a lot of different reasons. And so these users will not understand the meaning of the button. About 17% of pages were missing a set document language. Now, this decreased almost every year since 2019 when it was as high as 33%. Setting the document language is important for assistive technology. For instance, it tells screen readers which language to use, so the language will be voiced properly if the user has that language pack installed. And it also helps with translation tools. Now, there were also other accessibility issues found, and one of those was lack of or skipped headings. There was an average of 24 headings that were found on homepages. The number of headings on the homepages decreased by 4%. Now, I don't know if that means that more websites were using the correct use of headings, where headings shouldn't have been used, such as body text that shouldn't be a heading and these were fixed, or if these were headings that simply weren't present but they should have been. Maybe it's mostly the latter and some of the former, I don't know. But then another thing is that almost 17% of homepages had multiple H1 tags. And there were also skipped heading levels, and those were found on almost 38% of homepages. Almost 11% of homepages had no headings at all. So this is a problem because people who use screen readers or other assistive technology, they use headings to scan the content of a web page and to navigate web pages quickly. Using headings accessibly is really important so that these users of assistive technology can understand the page content, but they can also find what they need quickly. And I talked more in depth about that in episode 164 on accessible headings. Now, another set of errors was ARIA errors. Almost 75% of homepages used ARIA, and ARIA errors averaged 89 per page. That was a 26% increase in ARIA use over the previous year, and ARIA use has steadily increased since 2019, which is really interesting. Homepages that had ARIA code averaged about 34% more errors than those without ARIA code. Now, ARIA itself is not the issue. It's usually misuse or incorrect ARIA. The first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. Okay, another issue was ambiguous hyperlinks. About 13% of the homepages had ambiguous hyperlink text. Examples of this, which we see on most websites, are read more and click here. Fortunately, this decreased from the previous year. Now, I'm not saying you can't have those words in there, okay, but there are other things you have to do with them to make them not ambiguous. Okay, but ambiguous hyperlinks are problematic because users of assistive technology will not be able to tell where a link goes or tell if it's different from another link with the same link text on the page. Another type of error was lack of skip links. Only about 13% of homepages had a skip link, which was a decrease, which means no bueno. I talked about the importance of skip links and even how to add a skip link in episode 145, so be sure to check that out. Another group of errors was improperly coded tables. Only about 17% of the more than 1 million tables that they encountered used valid table code. Now, invalid table code means that users of assistive technology cannot understand the content of the table and then how the data relates to each other, like the rows, columns, and so forth. Okay, so now that we have all this data, what does this mean and what should you do with this information? Well, this information gives a really good starting point for things to check for and fix on existing websites. And I've also given you very brief explanations and examples of why this would be helpful to fix these issues too. Fixing these issues won't cover everything, of course. There's much more to do. But doing that, making those fixes, is a really great starting point, and it will have really big impact on the websites that you build. Now, if you want to find out 3 other easy things that you can do to make your websites more accessible, attend my free workshop, where I'll teach you this as well as 3 common mistakes that most web designers and developers make. You can register for the workshop at creative-boost.com/workshop-ready.